Hey everyone. Today's discussion will focus on Larry Hurtado's book, The Destroyer of the Gods, Early Christian Distinctiveness in the Roman World. The aim of the author is twofold. First, Hurtado identifies ways in which the early Christian movement distinguished itself not only from the Greco-Roman culture in which it grew, but also from the Jewish culture in which it was incubated. Secondly, he seeks to show how the subsequent success of Christianity has so shaped our modern understanding of religion as to redefine the category altogether, compared to the way that the ancients viewed and understood religion. What Western people mean when they say religion has been thoroughly influenced by a uniquely Christian perspective. David Foster Wallace, writing for the Wall Street Journal, shared the following story. Said there are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and asks, "What's water?" The immediate point of the fish story is that the most obvious, ubiquitous, important realities are often the ones that are hardest to see and talk about. Throughout the book, Hurtado identifies specific ways that early Christian movement stood out from the Greco-Roman world in which it was swimming, and so thoroughly introduced such a sweeping and long-lasting cultural change that what was once oddly and uniquely Christian became what most people would consider culturally normal and even expected, especially as one would define religion and certain theological ideas. I teach a course on the theology of Christian life in the undergraduate level at Indiana Wesleyan University in Marion, Indiana, my alma mater. The first week I asked students to tell me what they think of when they hear the word God. Now this is a Christian university, so many of the students are confessing believers, and they describe God in the typical Judeo-Christian fashion. However, there are a handful of students each semester who are not Christian. They take this course because it's a requirement for graduation. But even the non-Christian students describe their concept of God in surprisingly monotheistic and Judeo-Christian terms. They are swimming in cultural waters that have shaped their views of God in ways they can't even see. On this score, Hurtado is absolutely correct, and the first drops of those cultural waters were introduced by Christians to a Greco-Roman world that was largely disinterested and even hostile to the ideas and the ideals of what appeared to be a burgeoning Jewish cult that was quickly developing into a Greco-Roman following. Now, the focus of my presentation is on Chapter 1, Early Christians and Christianity in the Eyes of Non-Christians. The initial Jewish reaction to the rejection of the Christian movement is documented best within the New Testament itself. Although distinctions between Judaism and Christianity are reserved for Chapter 2, Chapter 1 identifies that Jewish opposition was the first and initially the most violent response to Christians and their proclamation of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah. Hurtado does an excellent job of showing how the young Pharisee Saul was zealous to destroy the way. Although the Apostle Paul never writes about his particular views of these early Christians when he was a Pharisee, it's clear from his actions and the actions of the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem that they viewed the way as a dangerously misguided religious movement built around what they believed to be a false Messiah that would lead the Jewish people into idolatry if it was not stopped. The persecution of Jesus' followers in Jerusalem can be found in Acts chapter 4, 1 through 22, chapter 5, chapter 7, chapter 8, chapter 9, chapter 12, and then eventually the arrest of the Apostle Paul in chapters 21 through 23. There are also examples of opposition that the Apostle Paul faced from the Jewish leaders and rulers in the greater Greco-Roman world in which he was a missionary. You find it in Pisidian Antioch, in Iconium, in Lystra, in Thessalonica, in Berea, in Corinth, in Ephesus, somewhere even an unnamed place in Greece, and then the entire province of Asia. The remainder of the chapter focuses on the pagan critics of the early Christian movement, particularly the writings of Tacitus, Suetonius, Pliny, Galen, Marcus Aurelius, Lucian, and Celsus. The attention of these prominent men, although negative in nature, does show that this Christian movement was wide and strong enough to merit comment and action. However, it's also an upper-class perspective on the Christian movement that does not represent the common person's interaction with followers of Jesus. This is the lament of really any historical researcher, as it was rare that the common person's life was ever detailed in literary form, except in the grossly stereotypical interpretations of the elites who did the writing. The strength of this chapter is Hurtado's description of how troubled many of the elites were at the rise of this sect within their midst, converting both Jews and pagans to a Jewish Messiah. However, Hurtado misses an opportunity to discuss a more common person's reaction to Christianity, which, like the initial Jewish response, is found within the New Testament, particularly within the book of Acts itself. The Apostle Paul's encounter with interested crowds in Pisidian Antioch in Acts 13, the divided town of Iconium in Acts 14, the people of Lystra who wanted to worship Paul and Barnabas in Acts chapter 14, the slave owners and authorities in Philippi in Acts chapter 16, the Areopagus philosophers in Athens in Acts chapter 17, and the angry Ephesians in Acts chapter 19. They're all examples of how ordinary pagans reacted to Christians and provide as much insight as the elites that provide their perspective for other elites to consume. Now, one other aspect of this chapter that falls a little bit short of the mark was the discussion of Christian withdrawal from pagan temple worship and its subsequent financial and social impact. Hurtado focuses on the economic aspects of this and mentions Acts chapter 19 and the Ephesian incident in support. Now, I agree with the economic and cultural aspects of the pagan culture and the fact that they overlap so as to nearly be inseparable. But it also must be acknowledged that there is a spiritual component to the pagan objections to Christian, especially their neglect of the temples. Christians who refused to honor the gods were putting the people of the city at risk. Ancient religious practices were largely constructed to keep the gods at bay and happy so that misfortune could be avoided. The Ephesian crowd didn't take up a collection to help support the financially troubled idol makers. What did they do? They ran into the assembly and shouted, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians," for hours on end. The objection was not merely economic and cultural. It was spiritual, or at least religiously oriented superstition. The strongest objection to Christianity was and has remained the exclusive worship of one God and not all the gods. I always liked the way that Richard Dawkins, a famous member of the New Atheists, described his atheistic beliefs. He said, "We're all atheists about most of the gods that humanity has ever believed in. Some of us just go one God further." The very idea that there is one God further to go is what Christianity brought to the table culturally, and it still resonates today. I enjoyed Hurtado's book, and my 11 pages of notes prove it. But I also think there is some room for improvement in adding some elements, especially in chapter 2 of The Common Man's Experience. However, enough is there to show us that Christianity was on the radar of the Greco-Roman world, for good and for bad, and that the influence that Christianity had over the next 3 centuries was unmistakable. Thanks for giving me a chance to share my extended thoughts on Chapter 1. Hopefully we'll see each other again in future classes.